Okay, so Alberto, you could go ahead and
Yeah,
we'll
sure.
get started today.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Alberto Souza. I want to start this event by thanking all of you for being here today with us. This webinar was conceived with the purpose of thinking about topics such as inclusion, anti-racism, and how it affects the well-being of students in the classrooms. The history of institutional racism is today more pressing than ever. The recent murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protest that followed remind us of the need to understand the structures of racism that are still at play in our society. I believe the arts and second language courses especially offer a unique perspective on which to look at this centuries-old problem. Decades of struggles against systemic racism seems to have reached an essential point. As educators and researchers in the humanities, it is our duty to carry the momentum forward. The current protest has articulated a continued frustration and a national struggle to define a new political imaginary. As Melissa Baralt has stated, and I am quoting here, it has been found that Black learners reported negative classroom experiences due to poor instructional environment and a lack of ethno-racial affinity in the curricula. In many cases, teachers did not know how to manage the discomfort provoked by discussing race and racism in class. For example, teachers were unable or unwilling to discuss US or Miami-based current event specific to the discrimination of Blacks, and never suggested Black populations as important social and cultural agents in the study of Hispanic and Caribbean culture. This negatively impacted Black students' sense of relevance and ability to identify with this subject material. End of the quote. With this in mind, this webinar intends to discuss ways in which courses in Spanish for businesses can challenge the situation and try to find and discuss new ways to make contents more relevant to students from different backgrounds by including elements from Afro-Caribbean culture, particularly those from the Hispanic Caribbean. I want to thank the cyber program at FIU, the Center of Latin American Caribbean Studies, and the Cuban Research Institute for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you to Dr. Maida Watson, Gillian Avendano, and Dr. Jorge Duani for supporting and guiding this initiative. Now I hand it over to Gillian Avendano, Director of the CIVEN program at FIU. Gillian.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, good morning to everyone. On behalf of FIU Cybers, we're the Center for International Business Education and Research. And we're one of 15 cyber centers throughout the United States with the main goal of promoting US competitiveness in international business. And we do so in a number of different ways, such as opportunities for research for our faculty. We do it in opportunities for study abroad and internships for our students. And another, we also help the community in becoming more competitive in this field. But one major part of the grant is language learning, specifically for business. So we've been working with Dr. Maida Watson for many years in helping to create these opportunities for students to not only learn languages, but to learn them in a way so that they can use them after they graduate, and that will help them to become more competitive in applying for jobs and things of that nature. Let me just go ahead and share my presentation here. There we go. Can everybody see my screen?
Sure.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned, we're one of 15 cybers here in the US, and we're a national resource center to just help our faculty, or help faculty, students, and the community to be more well-versed in themes of international business. And over this time, we've collaborated with a lot of different schools and organizations, and here are just a few. But specifically on this webinar, we're working with the Cuban Research Institute, the Department of Modern Languages, the Latin American and Caribbean Center, and the African and African Diaspora Department. So aside from doing the language programs, we also work a lot with collaborative online international learning, which Dr. Sosa Cabanas recently did a couple different iterations of COIL with universities in specifically teaching Spanish for business. And we found that that's a great way to incorporate international learning for our students, especially for students who might not have the possibility to study abroad or to do an international internship. This helps to connect them with students that live abroad and really allows them to learn about working in an international environment. We also have case competitions for MBA students, and we have lots of different events for K through 12 language teachers. We have one coming up at the end of August, so we can share information for anybody who's interested in attending that. It'll be similar to this theme, but it will be a one-day workshop. And we can email it afterward if anybody's interested in joining, or if you have colleagues that are K through 12 teachers who would like to learn more about this very interesting topic. And let's see. Yeah, and also I'd like to introduce my colleague, Marco Santos. He's here on the call, and he's, sorry, yeah, he's been working with us for a great amount of time, and he is our student assistant. So Marcos, you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone.
Let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen here. And Dr. Duani, if you'd like, you can go ahead and start early because we wanted to make sure that he had some time for question and answers.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank
Can
you.
you hear me now? Yes? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone involved in organizing the webinar, including Alberto Sosa, Mayra Watson, Jirena Ventano, and Marco Santos. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to be coming in and out of the seminar in the next few days. And I hope my presentation will be stimulating enough that it can generate some discussion. So my plan is to give you as short a presentation as possible and then to open it up for conversation, for Q&A. I understand the chat will be open for that purpose, so that after my presentation, I will be looking at some of the questions and then hopefully engaging in some conversation. So without further ado, I will share my screen, which is basically a presentation that I've used in my classes on Caribbean cultures and societies on defining the Caribbean. So that's the very first task that I usually, and I don't know where, can't see my own thingy here, but I need to open this up.
Yeah, I can see it. I don't know if you can see where you can click on slideshow.
Yeah, I don't see it in my screen.
F5.
Is it the fifth one?
If you press F5, you should be able to do it.
No. Oh, here we go. Okay. All right. So as I was saying, my first task in teaching about the Caribbean is precisely to define what the Caribbean is. And then because this particular webinar is focused on the Hispanic Caribbean, I'll begin with a general discussion of what would be the historical, geographic, and cultural characteristics of the Caribbean as a whole. And then I'll zero in on the Hispanic Caribbean, which you see here in your screen, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. So I'm going to focus on the islands of the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. And then I will zero in further on each one of the islands, particularly with regard to the question of race and national identity and how each one of these countries defines race. And perhaps that will be useful for those who are teaching Spanish to discuss with your students, or at least have it as a background to try to understand the similarities and differences in the way that Afro-Hispanic Caribbean cultures are defined in each place. So my agenda is as follows. I will first sort of provide an overview of what would be the basic characteristics of the Caribbean region. I approach the Caribbean following Sidney Mintz's classic essay of the Caribbean as a social cultural area, and I'll try to explain what that means. It doesn't mean necessarily that all Caribbean countries share the same culture or the same history or even the same political development, as you will see throughout the presentation. And then, as I mentioned, there's, I think, enough information to distinguish the insular Hispanic Caribbean from the rest of the Caribbean, namely what has been called the non-Hispanic Caribbean, which is actually quite complicated, but referring to those areas of the Caribbean that were colonized by the British, the French, the Dutch, and to a lesser extent, the Danish. And again, we focus on the West Indies, on the islands of the Caribbean, rather than the rims of the Caribbean Sea in Central America and South America. Although again, there's a case to be made for many shared characteristics between the islands and some of the mainland countries, like Panama, for instance, just to mention one that Maida Watson has been working for a long, long time. And finally, as I said, I want to dwell on how race is defined and treated in the Caribbean. And particularly, I want to talk about the racial terminology systems that are prevalent in each one of these islands. And you'll see some similarities, but also some very unique characteristics that I will talk about throughout the presentation. So to begin then properly, this is a sort of a blurry map, I'm sorry, of the Caribbean area, which would include Central America and parts of North and South America, because it sort of illustrates one of the main themes in Caribbean studies, which is that the Caribbean, both the islands as well as some of the mainland countries of Central America and South America, belong to a broader region that has been called variously by anthropologists, historians, Afro-America or Plantation America. And I will talk about plantations in just a minute, because it is sort of one of the defining features of the region. Afro-America, as the term suggests, or African America, because of the significance of the African population, mostly slaves, but also some free African origin population that lived in the Caribbean during the colonial period beginning in 1492. And as you can see from the map, this is a wide-ranging area that would include a lot of territory all the way from southern Florida through parts of Mexico, bordering on the Gulf of Mexico. Again, some coastal areas of Central America, Panama, and then the northern coast of Colombia, Venezuela, and the three Guyanas, although you only see here two of them. And then, of course, all of the islands, both from the larger Antilles to the Eastern Caribbean or Lesser Antilles. So the question is, what do these places have in common, and why group them together as a general region? And again, the title itself, Afro-America, Plantation America, gives you some idea of what these countries and regions have shared historically, namely, in terms of the names, the prevalence of people of African origin throughout the history of these countries, as well as the dominance of a single socioeconomic institution that has been called the plantation, primarily the sugar plantation, during the slavery period from the 1500s to the end of the 1900s. So the sugar plantation, as I just noted, has been the prevalent socioeconomic institution throughout the history of the Caribbean. Here's a very interesting representation by a Spanish painter who lived in Cuba during the last half of the 19th century, right before, a few years before the abolition of slavery. But you wouldn't know it from the painting. It appears to be frozen in time, in which, again, people of African origin, slaves in particular, and soon to be liberated children, for instance, who stand in the middle of the painting by Landaluce, as well as some of the middlemen, the white man on the horse that stands clearly from the rest of the slave force. And then in the back, you see what the Spaniards called the ingenios, and which became part of the landscape of Cuban and Caribbean countries throughout much of the colonial period and even throughout the 20th century. So the sugar plantation had a number of important socioeconomic characteristics, of which I'll highlight some of the basic ones. First of all, it was a large-scale capitalistic enterprise geared toward the export of a single crop, in this case sugar, but also in some cases coffee, tobacco in some cases, as well as other commercial enterprises that, again, and a second characteristic of these plantation enterprises was that they were geared toward exporting initially to the European market, more recently to the US market, and even in the case of Cuba, to the former Soviet Union. So the markets, as well as the capital sources for the plantation, typically were outside the Caribbean. The other important characteristic for our purposes here is that wherever the plantation took root, and even in the old world, in Europe and Asia and the Middle East, where it was perfected, tended to rely on forced labor, primarily slaves, not only African slaves, but in the Caribbean case, those tended to be the primary source of labor. Other forms of coerced labor, like indentured servitude, as in the case of East Indians and Chinese, who arrived in large numbers throughout the 19th century and 20th century in Cuba, were also used, as well as free labor, in quotes, because in many cases, as in the case of Puerto Rico in the 19th century, many of these so-called free workers were forced to work under conditions of serfdom. So those would be, I think, the main three characteristics that I want to highlight at this point, and perhaps later we can talk a little bit more about what exactly the plantation entailed with regard to the social and cultural effects of that institution. The second characteristic that, and here I'm drawing primarily on Mintz's classic essay, which I already mentioned, the Caribbean as a cultural area, which is very useful for teaching purpose. You can Google it and find it in various places, is of course that the geographic location of most of the Caribbean, if not all of it, is entirely within the tropics. And that that leads to these sort of paradisiacal images, which are widely used for touristic purposes. This is one image from St. John in the US Virgin Islands. The water, the sun, the lush vegetation, but also, of course, unfortunately, the proneness to natural disasters like hurricanes. And of course, right now we're in the middle of the hurricane season, and Florida, again, is very vulnerable to these kinds of phenomena. And so that throughout the history of the Caribbean, this geographic characteristic, the kind of weather, the kind of terrain. In this case, we see very hilly terrain in the US Virgin Islands, but in other islands like Cuba or the Dominican Republic, as well as in Puerto Rico, you have coastal lowlands where the plantations tended to concentrate. And also the population of African origin tended to be more dominant. And so the second characteristic then of the Caribbean region is that most of the weather is very even throughout the year. There are minor differences in temperature between winter and summer. And actually those distinctions are so minor that it's actually better to talk about the rainy season and the dry season, depending again on the month of the year. And this is very important, again, for the kinds of agricultural enterprises that were set up in the Caribbean, namely the sugar plantation, which tended to dominate the entire region. The third major characteristic that I want to underline here is that the existing indigenous population, once the Europeans, first the Spaniards, then the others, the English, the French, the Dutch, etc., arrived in the region, was decimated in the first 50 years or so of conquest. So by 1550, there were very few descendants of the Taínos or the other indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. And so during the next phase, which is the phase in which the settlement and population of the Caribbean really takes off, most of the people who settled in the Caribbean were from somewhere else, primarily from Africa, but also from Europe, in particular countries in Europe, especially those which had metropolitan interests in the region. And then later we will see too a smaller number of other groups coming in from Asia. I already mentioned the Chinese, the East Indians, Indonesia in the case of some of the Guyana, and then small numbers of Middle Eastern people, Jewish people, as well as later on movements of Caribbean people within the region. So for instance, people from Jamaica and Haiti going to Cuba and the Dominican Republic in the late 19th century and first half of the 20th century. So as a result of this mingling and mixing of people of Amerindian, European, and African origin, you see, as in this picture of Trinidad Carnival, which is probably one of the best examples of the blending, not just of people, but also of cultures, musics, and languages. So the population of the Caribbean, unlike the rest of the mainland Latin American countries, which still have a very large indigenous population, do not have that strong influence of the pre-Columbian cultures, except in a few places where you still have, as in Dominica, for example, or St. Vincent or Belize, descendants of the first inhabitants of the Americas. The racial composition of the Caribbean, again, is a very distinctive characteristic that, again, would be one of the reasons why we're here today to talk about this. So in some cases, in many cases, you have, and these are the most recent statistics that I could find overall for the Caribbean from a source that you may wonder, how reliable are the CIA World Factbook, but actually it is quite reliable because it draws on the censuses of each island. So you see, for example, that there are some countries like Barbados, Haiti, Jamaica, and the US Virgin Islands, which have a clear majority of people of African origin and are classified as Black. However, there's some other countries, Belize, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, etc. African descendants are not the majority of the population, and I'll try to explain further how that came to be. And then you see, for instance, that the population classified as white vary greatly from one country to another. In the case of Cuba and Puerto Rico, you have a very large, the majority actually, of the population being defined as white in censuses. Dominican Republic has a smaller percentage of people defined as white, but still quite substantial compared to some of the other Caribbean countries. Then you have the third component that I already mentioned, the Asians, which are substantial in places like Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana, although they're not shown. Guyana is not shown on this chart, and other people who are primarily mixtures of Black, white, and something else. So mulattoes would be the term that would be used, or mestizo in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, and we will return to that terminology in a few moments. Notice that the Dominican Republic, in the countries represented in the chart, is the one country that has the largest proportion of racially mixed people according to the latest estimates. So again, it would be the most mulatto country in the Caribbean, and arguably in Latin America, except perhaps for Brazil. So that's one characteristic to remember, that when we talk about the Afro-Hispanic Caribbean or the Afro-Caribbean, there needs to be more attention to the local and regional variations from one country to another, and from one region, a sub-region of the Caribbean to the next. There's no question that the African heritage has been a primary influence in shaping the contemporary form that Caribbean cultures have today. This is an example from the mid-18th, 19th century, of a classic engraving by a Frenchman who spent a lot of time in Cuba, Frederic Mial, and he focused on the celebration of the Day of Kings, or the Three Kings Day, Epiphany, January 6th, which in the Spanish colonial period was a moment in which these groups of African descendants organized around mutual aid clubs known as cabildos were allowed to celebrate their African music, their African religion, and as you can see from the picture, even the costumes that were preserved, not only during the 19th century, but even to this day. Notice there are at least 4 costumed people in the image, especially the one in the center, who is called, by the way, in Cuba, a culona, although that can have, Spanish negative connotation. It's actually written with a K, and refers again to the costume of this man who is right at the center of the picture. Notice that surrounding the main paraders and masqueraded African descendants in the center, you see other people watching. It's sort of a carnivalesque kind of scene. There is a very well-dressed man on the right, a black man who seems to be imitating the Spanish formal attire of the day, and he would probably be collecting some money, some donations by spectators who would, of course, enjoy seeing this kind of spectacle in the streets of Havana. And also we see in the back the image of what seems to be the San Francisco convent in Old Havana, which again was one of the major places in which these sort of celebrations of Afro-Cuban culture began. Many anthropologists and other scholars like Fernando Ortiz have looked at this particular picture and this specific custom to argue that there is a strong connection between particular areas of Africa, particularly in West Africa, not only the Yoruba, but also Bantu-speaking Congo people who were able to preserve their religious, musical, and drumming traditions, as you can see on the right with one of the men playing a small drum. A further characteristic that I think distinguishes the Caribbean from other parts of the world, even surrounding areas in Central and South America, is that, of course, Spanish dominates in only 3 territories, Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. And actually, the rest of the region is extremely diverse in their political heritage. And some of these countries, as I will note in the next slide, still remain colonies or territories, dependent territories of their mother countries, France, the US, UK, and the Netherlands. But for now, what I would like to highlight in this map is that the very checkered history of colonization in the Caribbean, involving multiple colonial powers, sometimes rivaling each other, as in the case, which is quite unique in the Caribbean and other parts of the world, the island of Hispaniola, which is actually shared by 2 countries now independent, Haiti on the west side and Dominican Republic on the right side. And as many of you will probably remember from your history textbooks, Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, as it was called before the Haitian Revolution, was settled and occupied by the French until the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century, whereas the east side of Hispaniola, Santo Domingo, now called República Dominicana, remained under Spain, except for a few periods in which it was occupied by the Haitian army, and also a later period in which it became, for the second time, a colony of Spain. Around the Caribbean, you will see again independent countries like Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, for example, but also a number of other dependent territories. And that's why you see the French flag, the British flag, and even the US flag in Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. To focus more specifically on those territories that are non-independent or that are colonial in many ways, here's a specific map that shows you again that aside from the three countries of the Spanish, the larger Antilles, Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and the fourth one being Jamaica, many of the other countries in the Eastern Caribbean are attached to the former or current metropoles. You see, again, I mentioned Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. Many countries, the smaller countries, and particularly in the northern coast of Venezuela, the so-called ABC, Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire are part of the Netherlands still and have a complicated relationship with that country. There are British overseas territories ranging from Dominica. Dominica is no longer a territory, but other countries, again, along the chain of islands known as the Eastern Caribbean. And then there are several French overseas departments, such as Martinique, Guadeloupe, and in the northern coast of South America, French Guiana. So these colonial or neo-colonial, semi-colonial ties that continue to tie the region to outside major powers, especially in Europe and in North America, are another defining characteristic of the Caribbean as a whole. Linguistically, as well as politically, the Caribbean is extremely diverse. And here's another map that sort of captures that tremendous diversity in the languages. These are just the official languages. I'll mention something about the unofficial ones in a moment, but notice that Spanish predominates in the region in terms of the number of people who speak the language in Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. However, in terms of the number of territories, French and English are actually more common, particularly again in that sort of blown up map on the Eastern Caribbean from places like Dominica, like St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, Grenada, etc. So in terms of the number of places where you will hear English, usually with a Creole accent, is larger than the Spanish-speaking territory. The case of the Dutch is quite odd, to say the least, in this context, because very few people actually speak the language in the Caribbean. Even in the Netherlands Antilles, which you see in the middle of the map, in Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire, they actually, many of them speak English rather than Dutch. Dutch was never really a major language of communication in the Dutch Caribbean. Now, I mentioned that in addition to the official languages that you will hear if you go through the region or if you talk to people who come from there, there are many unofficial languages, usually some version of Creole, Creole English, Creole French in particular, or Creole Dutch, as well as in the case of Haiti and Curacao, there have been official attempts to promote the Creoles of those countries and are actually taught in schools, even though not at the same level as the official European languages. So Papiamento, for instance, is the actual lingua franca of the Dutch-speaking Caribbean, which again would be a misnomer because Dutch is not spoken as much as Spanish is in the Hispanic Caribbean. And then you have other minority languages ranging from indigenous languages that still are spoken in places like the French Guyana or Belize, but no longer are used in everyday forms of communication. By the way, since I'm looking at the map here, let me just note that typically in discussions such as the one that we're having right now, the Caribbean is thought to include those four mainland territories you see on the map: Belize on the Central American coast, and then the three Guyanas, Guyana proper, Suriname, and French Guiana, because again of many of the same characteristics, historical and cultural as well as political, define these places and distinguish them from the rest of the areas in which they're located. Okay, moving further then, in this part of the presentation, I want to focus specifically on the so-called insular Hispanic Caribbean, so the three major islands, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. Jamaica would be excluded. It would be the only one of the larger Antilles that is not part of the Hispanic Caribbean, although I should note that, of course, Jamaica, like the rest of the Caribbean, at one point was part of Spain, and therefore some historical influence can be felt there. So why separate the three Spanish-speaking Caribbean islands from the rest? I would argue that there are some characteristics that are distinctive of these three islands. First of all, as I just mentioned, that they are relatively large compared to the rest of the Caribbean, particularly Cuba, as well as the Dominican Republic, which overwhelm the region in terms of their territory as well as their population. The fact that they were conquered in 1492 in the case of Cuba, and the Dominican Republic 1493 in the case of Puerto Rico, and remain in place as colonial territories of Spain all throughout the colonial period until the 19th century. Earlier, in the case of Santo Domingo, which, as I mentioned before, was occupied by their neighbors for 22 years, and then again was re-annexed by Spain briefly for a few years in the 19th century. But all three territories experienced the largest legacy of Spanish colonization as compared to, for example, the rest of the hemisphere, which, as you know, became largely independent from Spain in the early 19th century, where in the case of Cuba and Puerto Rico, were the last remaining colonies of Spain in the Americas until the Spanish-Cuban-American War of 1898. Only the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific Ocean had such a long period of Spanish colonization in other parts of the world. As a result of this, and again, to our point here today, the Spanish language really became the major form of communication in the region. Linguists have noted and tried to explain why a Creole form of Spanish, the same way the Haitian Creole or Papiamento emerged in other places, did not take root in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, although you do find pockets of people who speak Creole, for example, Haitian descendants in the eastern part of Hispaniola, in current Santo Domingo. And also beyond language, cultural practices like music, religion, food are clearly marked by the Spanish influence even to this day, which also gives the three islands a sense of familiarity and recognition. And of course, now I'm thinking of the famous phrase by Lola Rodriguez de Tio, well-known Puerto Rican poet who was exiled in Cuba after its independence, who wrote those famous verses that many Cubans and Puerto Ricans have learned by heart, which is that Cuba and Puerto Rico are like two wings of one bird. And so this metaphor would also even apply to the Dominican Republic, because they do share a number of cultural characteristics that I hope I will be able to show briefly. The Catholic Church was the single official church during the entire Spanish colonial period, even though in some cases, as in Puerto Rico, there were some small Protestant churches that were allowed to operate before the end of the Spanish colonial period. But in any case, the influence of Catholicism is really very visible in many places, from the cult of the saints to, for instance, the devotion to the Virgin of Mary, particularly the Caridad del Cobre in Cuba, or the Virgin of Altagracia in the Dominican Republic. Even the calendar, the ritual calendar of festivities of saints and churches and holidays that to this day marks the daily life of people in all three countries. Those are examples of influence to the naming of people who are often called Jose and Maria, although of course nowadays the more creative naming practices of Cubans, as in the Generation Y, or in the case of Puerto Rico, where they basically make up new names, especially for children, for women. But in any case, that's again a defining characteristic of the Hispanic Caribbean, as opposed to the rest of the region, in which various forms of Protestant congregations have emerged, and of course the Afro-Caribbean religions of Voodoo and Candomblé. Well, that's in the case of Brazil, but it's sort of the equivalent of Santeria in Cuba. I've already noted that the population, the contemporary population of the Hispanic Caribbean, is very much a mixture of Amerindians, Spaniards, Africans, and I should also add some other groups that have settled the region for centuries. And therefore, as a result, many people in the Hispanic Caribbean today have very different looks and actually blended looks, as I'll explain in a moment. Another characteristic that defines the Hispanic Caribbean and that doesn't necessarily distinguish it clearly from the rest of the region is the influence of the United States, which can be traced to the 19th century and the attempts by US policymakers to annex one or another of the territories, particularly Santo Domingo or Cuba or Puerto Rico in the 20th century. But in any case, the economic, political, and even cultural presence of the United States and the overwhelming dominance of the United States as a neo-colonial power throughout the region, and very clearly colonial in the case of Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, is a defining characteristic of the region, which of course suggests that even after the European metropolitan powers retreated from the Caribbean, partially because, as we saw earlier, there's still a very strong presence of those European countries like the British, the French, and the Dutch. Clearly, the dominant power in the 20th century is the United States. Finally, I would single out, which is one of the areas of expertise that I have pursued for a long time, that especially during the second half of the 20th century, all three countries of the Hispanic Caribbean, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, have experienced mass migration to the US mainland for various reasons. We can talk about that later on if you want in the Q&A session, but in any case, it's quite significant that a large proportion of the population of the Hispanic Caribbean actually doesn't live in the Hispanic Caribbean. The most dramatic example is Puerto Rico, which already has about 2/3 of all people of Puerto Rican origin living in the United States mainland. So that comes to about 5.8 million people as compared to 3.2 million on the island. And that has to do with the fact that Puerto Ricans are US citizens and have no legal barriers to migrate, as well as some of the more recent catastrophes like the economic recession, the impact of Hurricane Maria, and other major disasters. In the case of Cuba, of course, the impact of the Cuban Revolution of 1959, the ongoing mass migration from the island that continues to this day is another example. And finally, in the Dominican Republic, we know that after the assassination of the dictator Leonidas Trujillo in 1961, the political and economic instability of that island has led to the migration of millions of people of Dominican ancestry. And so, again, overall, I think those are the major reasons why it seems to make sense to single out the Spanish-speaking Caribbean from the rest of the islands. Now, specifically regarding racial issues, I want to then mention a few characteristics. As I began my presentation, I focused on plantation and slavery and how these lingering traumatic effects of those two processes, the establishment of fruit plantations manned by mostly African slaves. In the case of the Hispanic Caribbean, I think what needs to be added is that there were at least 2 or perhaps 3 cycles of plantation slavery. First of all, in the very early colonial period between 1500 and 1550, more or less, in which, of course, many plantations actually relied on indigenous Taino labor, which amounted basically to slavery. And then more significantly, the massive introduction of people of African slave origin to work on the plantations as slaves. Then there was a second reemergence of plantations after a long period of decadence until the late 18th century as a result primarily of the Haitian Revolution and the dislocation of the French plantations on Saint Domingue, and then Cuba, Puerto Rico, and eventually Santo Domingo also began to rely increasingly on the plantation in ways that were very similar to the non-Hispanic Caribbean during the middle period of colonization. Related to this point, I think it's useful to point out that all three colonies of the Hispanic Caribbean were largely settler colonies as opposed to plantation colonies for much of their history, again, between the mid 16th century and the late 19th century, which allowed for the development of local institutions, of vernacular dialect of Spanish, and a growing sense, in fact, of national identity, of Creole identity, separate from peninsular identity, referring to Spain. And that's an important historical characteristic that, again, distinguishes these islands from others and explains why, comparatively speaking, the sense of being Cuban or Dominican and Puerto Rican seems to have developed earlier than in Jamaica or in Haiti and other places that experienced the plantation model during most of its colonial history. The third characteristic that I would like to point out here is that all three Hispanic Caribbean countries, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, received a large number of Spanish immigrants, mostly Cuba, but also to a lesser extent Puerto Rico and Santo Domingo throughout the entire Spanish colonial period. In fact, in the case of Cuba, more Spaniards arrived in Cuba after independence between 1902 and 1930 than throughout the entire colonial period. And within this particular topic, I would also comment that one group that settled throughout the Hispanic Caribbean, people from the Canary Islands, seems to have had an important demographic, economic, and cultural impact in music, even in the way that Caribbean people in the Hispanic Caribbean speak, using words such as guagua for bus, which is also used in the Canary Islands. And of course, later on, the massive migration from Galicia and other parts of the Iberian Peninsula that have left a mark in the cultures and societies of the three islands. As a result of the mingling of various populations, particularly African origin and European origin, there was a development of a very large population of color, as it was called then, or pardos and morenos in the local vocabulary. And clearly by the end of the colonial period in the Hispanic Caribbean, there was a very large number of people who could be classified as mulattoes or mestizos or various other local variants of those terms. And this group of people will become very significant for all kinds of purposes, political, cultural, linguistic, and of course, racial in the later post-colonial period in Cuba and the Dominican Republic and the contemporary US colonial stage in Puerto Rico. Therefore, the racial mixture of Cubans, Dominicans, and Puerto Ricans is very well known and very well documented. I'll show you some of the census figures in a moment for each one of the countries. And therefore, the celebration actually of mestizaje, which is the Spanish word that's used throughout the former Spanish Empire and still quite common in the Hispanic Caribbean, not just as a way to recognize that history of mingling of populations and cultures and so on, but also to distinguish what is the major characteristic of the Hispanic Caribbean, which again is the combination, the hybrid nature of its culture and its population. Finally, I would also anticipate, and I will develop this point a little further in a moment, that all three countries of the Hispanic Caribbean have elaborated a myth of racial democracy, like Brazil and other countries of Latin America, but that basically, because of this history of mestizaje, and because of the various slippery terms that distinguish blacks, whites, mulattoes, and people in between, there is an official celebration of that diversity in all three countries. And in fact, often a denial that there's even any racism in the Hispanic Caribbean. This particular myth takes different forms in all three places, in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, which I will note in a moment. Now, before I go into each country's peculiarities regarding race relations, I want to highlight what I think are the major points in common. First of all, as opposed to the United States and other countries of the world like South Africa, the main characteristic to define race operationally in the Caribbean is actually physical appearance, or phenotype, as anthropologists like to call it more technically. And not just skin color, but also hair texture, facial features, and other bodily characteristics that are immediately apparent to most people. And that makes, for example, if you look at the picture on the left in this bullet, for even people who are related biologically, these two girls, which I think are sisters, could be considered of different races because they look different. That again contrasts with the way in which race is typically defined here in the United States, and where physical appearance is important, but more important is sort of family ancestry. The second characteristic that I think is common throughout the Hispanic Caribbean regarding race relations is that the main division is between whites and light mulattoes. So there is the phenomenon of passing, so to speak, or lightning, in which people who have certain characteristics like straight hair or light skin color could be accepted as part of the white elite. And then on the opposite side, you have people who are so-called pure white, blacks, or who have visible black characteristics like the hair and the skin color in particular. So you have that, I would say it's a threefold division between blacks, whites, and mulattoes, and then some mulattoes are allowed to pass as whites. This is a so-called mulatto escape hatch that has been documented in Venezuela as well. Third major characteristic is that Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans recognize that there's a wide variety of people on a scale from black to white and everything in between. And as I'll show you in a moment, they have developed a very elaborated or complicated set of terminologies that is based on racist assumptions, clearly, but that distinguish and recognize this widespread racial mixture that characterizes the Hispanic Caribbean. And finally, I would say, in general, ethnic minorities, I'm thinking of Haitians in the Dominican Republic, or even Dominicans in Puerto Rico, which I'll talk about in a minute, have been racialized primarily as Black, and therefore have been subjected to the same kinds of stigmas and stereotypes and discrimination that people of African origin have been experiencing in many parts of the world, but particularly in the Caribbean. So there's this question of race and ethnicity and how that is portrayed within a national identity, and why some groups are excluded from the definition of what it means to be Cuban, Dominican, or Puerto Rican, while others are actually included. The case of Middle Eastern immigrants is quite interesting. For example, people from the Lebanon and Syria, which have settled in all three countries, because they typically have been incorporated in the middle and upper sectors of society and have been defined as white rather than as Black or mulatto. My final comment on the shared characteristics of the Hispanic Caribbean, and I wish I can go a little faster so I can leave some time for conversation later, is that one of the ways in which this peculiar system of racial classification and this ideology of race has been expressed throughout the history of the region is that the visual arts in all three countries, I'll show you three examples that I think are quite clear, have tended to portray the national identity of each country as largely white, if not very white, as in the case of the left, the classic painting by Ramon Frade, or Daily Bread, which portrays a jíbaro, or a peasant in the highlands of Puerto Rico, clearly someone who descends from Spain, or perhaps the Canary Islands, but someone who's very poor, who doesn't have any shoes, who's very not well fed and probably anemic, but still romanticized and idealized as the most typical, the quintessential image of Puerto Rican identity. Similarly, for Cuba, I found this very well-known painting by Eduardo Abela, who focuses on a similar type or archetype, the Guajiros, the peasants of Cuba, who are a little more brown in color, as I see him here, but clearly not black, and perhaps suggests that Abela was also thinking of the great paintings of the muralists in Mexico because of their facial characteristics. And the woman in the back, who seems to have some indigenous characteristics, perhaps because of the skin color, because of the hair. But in any case, these are clearly, these characters are clearly not depicted as African in origin. And again, because of the physical and cultural environment in which they live, probably can trace their origin. For example, the custom of the cockfights, which was brought to Cuba by Canary Island immigrants, is another pointer as to where their ethnic origin is from. And finally, a more recent painting by Ismael Checo, which reproduces, I think, the same trope. And in this case, the painting is called Cibaeño, from the region of the Cibao in the Dominican Republic, which is supposed to have the largest percentage of people of European origin in the Dominican Republic. Notice too that they all have the classic straw hats, which are considered to be symbolic of each country's national identity. And again, very light skin, no signs of any African mixing in this model's family history. Now, I want to then say a few words about each country of the Hispanic Caribbean and about the race relations of each country. And then hopefully when I'm done, I can open it up for conversation. These are 20th century official statistics on Cuba. And I could have gone back to the 19th century, but I decided to focus on the 20th century because the pattern by then had been quite clear. About 2/3 of the population of Cuba has remained classified as white throughout the 20th century, with some slight decline, as you can see, after the last pre-revolutionary census of 1953, but still close to 60% of all Cubans in the last census of Cuba were considered to be white. Similarly, the percentage of Black Cubans has declined and then increased somewhat in the mid 20th century, but has remained quite stable with a small minority. I think it's about 10% of the entire population in the last census. But notice what happens with the mestizo, that's the official term that's used in Cuba, although again, in practice, it would mean mixtures of Black and white. That has increased significantly, particularly after the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which suggests that there are more intermarriage, there's more intermarriage between people considered Black and white since the revolution. But other than that, the racial picture of the Cuban population has remained remarkably steady throughout the 20th century. And again, compared to the rest of the Caribbean, is reflective of the mass importation of people of Spanish origin and to a lesser extent, other European countries. Now, the folk racial terminology in Cuba is quite interesting. I just want to show you some of the folk terms that have been documented in the scholarly literature. Here's one article by Jesus Guanche where I took these terms from. And again, typically the Cuban system distinguishes between three main types: white, brown, and mulatto, mestizo, and Black. And notice how each particular category can be subdivided into many different terms that are more specific like blanco, which is of course same as white, rubio or blonde, and then other sort of picturesque terms like blanco lechoso, which is a very light skinned white albino, colorado, which is red skin. And then moving further to the middle level of the system, there's mulatto, blanconazo, which is light mulatto, color cartucho, which I think is quite offensive today, would refer to cardboard color or yeah, like a light brown color. Then moro or Moorish, going back to the Spanish conquest, the reconquest of the peninsula. Notice that the word Indio, which actually appears in all three countries, does not necessarily mean people who can trace their heritage to the pre-Columbian indigenous population, but actually people who look Indian. And that means, in this context, straight hair, copper skin, and certain kinds of facial features that are associated with the so-called Indians. Habao is a very popular term that's used in all three countries, which refers to a light-skinned, curly-haired person who obviously has traces of both African and European origin, and typically is used in a pejorative way. And then further on, you have various terms from negro or negro, negro azul or blue black, negro color teléfono, which maybe doesn't make much sense to younger people who haven't seen a black telephone in their lives, a landline telephone. And then other characteristics like the form of the head, cabeza de puntilla, which is supposed to refer to the cone form of certain heads of African descent. I also wanted to highlight that even today, there is the racialization of some groups, like the so-called Palestinos, which does not refer to people from Palestine and the Middle East. It refers to people from the province of Oriente in Cuba who have been migrating within Cuba, particularly to Havana, for a long time. And here's one image which I took from this article that talks about Palestinians as being like illegal immigrants or refugees, right? They come from the East and they also are treated and considered to be people who are almost like refugees from another country. And so if you go to Havana and you talk to people who live there, you will hear often this term Palestino used in a very negative way that harks back to colonial slavery days. My final point about the Cuban racial situation, which of course merits further attention, and we can develop a few of those points later, is that even after efforts by the Cuban revolutionary government in the early 1960s to abolish racial discrimination in housing, in schools, in government, there is clearly racial inequality in Cuba today, as this picture suggests. And there's evidence, in fact, that racial inequality has increased in the past few decades after the reintroduction of the tourist industry and the very strong permanence of racial attitudes that, for example, do not promote racial intermarriage, even though, as I noted earlier, there is some statistical evidence that there are more of those than there were in the past. But in any case, this is an important problem that requires further study in contemporary Cuba. Now, moving to the Dominican Republic, as I already mentioned, this is the country of the Caribbean, perhaps the entire Americas, in which the proportion of people classified as mestizo or mulatto is the largest. The latest census, unfortunately, is 1960. So here you have something like 3/4 of all Dominicans being considered to be mestizo, or actually Indio, which is the common word for a people of mixed African and Spanish origin in the Dominican Republic. So this is the census numbers that you can find from the Dominican government online, and unfortunately they stopped asking about race in 1960. So we would assume that the proportions are similar, but it's very difficult to quantify. The terms that are used, the folk racial terms that are used in the Dominican Republic, some of them are very similar to Cuba and in Puerto Rico, although this particular source that I've used, Daisy Josefina Guzman, actually proposes that there are 5, not 3, main categories or terms in the Dominican Republic, ranging from white to black, but notice that she groups white mulatto and mulatto black together. The most significant aspect of the Dominican racial classification system to me is the existence of those middle terms, variously called Indio lavao, which refers to the whitewashed character of the skin, Indio claro, so light-skinned Indian, Indio fino, meaning referring to the fine characteristics of the person, and then others down the pyramid, like Trigueño oscuro, Indio quemado, burned Indian, dirty Indian, and mulatto. The term cocolo, which is heard in the Dominican Republic as well as in Puerto Rico, seems to refer to the English-speaking migration from the Eastern Caribbean to the Dominican Republic, and to a lesser extent to Puerto Rico in the early 20th century, and now is used in a more general sense to refer to dark-skinned people. A second characteristic, in addition to the obsession with the so-called Indian character of the Dominican population, is the concern with hair. And if you live in a place like Miami or New York, you know that there are many Dominican beauty salons like this one, which can be found in the Dominican Republic, where particularly women go to regularly to straighten their hair. And the expense and the energy that they put into this ritual process is quite remarkable. And even scholars have studied in detail what it is about the hair that draws so many Dominican women to chemically process their hair so that it looks straight. Well, the easiest explanation, of course, is the denial of blackness and an attempt to whiten one's appearance, particularly the hair. But also, in the case of the United States, there seems to be an effort to acquire a certain Dominican look or a Hispanic look, which is actually in between black and white and not necessarily an entire denial of blackness. Be that as it may, as I have already noted, this practice of straightening the hair is a major feature of the Dominican racial system. And as I anticipated before, the presence of a very large number of people of Haitian origin who have crossed the border to the Dominican Republic since the beginning of the 20th century. Some estimates suggest that at least 500,000, perhaps 1 million people are Dominican Haitian. In any case, regardless of the numbers, it's clear that people like the Haitian construction worker that you see portrayed in the front have become part of the Dominican landscape, largely as an ethnic and racial minority that is despised by many Dominicans who consider them to be even less than human, and who in the past few years have struggled to be recognized legally. And in fact, the Dominican government has deprived them of constitutional rights to health and education. This is a complicated issue that, again, warrants further attention. But for now, what I would say is that in the Dominican Republic, actually, the word negro or black is reserved for Haitians, not for Dominicans. Any Dominican, like the one in the back, who is holding that rope, would probably be considered Indio rather than negro, because again of this racialized division between Haitians and Dominicans that continues to this day. My final case then is Puerto Rico, and I want to begin by noting that Puerto Rico very clearly shows, even going back to the early 19th century, a growing trend toward the increase of the white population, especially in the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. We have experienced, according to the census, a decline in the number of people who describe themselves as white in the census, but in any case, it's clearly the majority, whereas the non-white sector of the population, that will include blacks as well as mulattoes, which was roughly equivalent to the white segment in the 1802 census, has declined steadily, except for, again, the last couple of censuses since 2000. But still, everyone who has looked at this carefully believes that these statistics don't quite reflect the actual mixture of the Puerto Rican population, sorry, and the large presence of Afro-Puerto Ricans in the population. Folk racial terms in Puerto Rico are similarly complex. I have documented at least 20 such terms, ranging from blanco to negro, and you will recognize some of the same terms used in the other countries. Guaynabito is an interesting term because it comes from Guaynabo, which is the municipality in Puerto Rico with the highest per capita income and is well known to have a large proportion of white people and upper middle class people. Then there are some folk terms like café con leche or piel canela, cinnamon skin, that refer to in between colors between white and black. And again, cocolo, you see at the bottom, quemadito, which refers to burned skin, and the euphemism de color. Not to mention that many of these terms are often used in Puerto Rico and in the other two countries in their diminutive form. So blanquito, negrito, or quemadito, for example, and they're supposed to reflect a kind of close, emotional, and even positive connotation among people who use it. The dominant discourse of race in Puerto Rico is best represented, I think, in the seal of the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, which was founded in 1956. And what you see, of course, here, and I'll spend just a couple of moments on the images, are the three sort of canonical roots, as they have been called in Puerto Rico and other parts of the Caribbean: the Indian on the left, the Spanish in the center, front and center, and the African. And notice that each one of them has certain cultural attributes aligned with them. So in the case of the Taíno on the left, he is holding a semi, which is one of the sort of remnants of the Taíno religion, as well associated with corn. And there seems to be a tobacco plant as well in the background. The Spaniard, who is the best dressed of the three, and I don't know how he can survive the tropical weather, but anyway, he's holding the grammar book by Nebrija from the Spanish language. And of course, there are three crosses in the back referring to the ships that arrived from Spain in 1493. And then finally, there's the African root, the man on the right who is holding a machete, which is used to cut cane, and cane again is associated with him. And at the bottom, right next to his feet, you see a typical Gigante mask, which is associated with carnival and African traditions that have survived to this day in Puerto Rico. Many people have noted that the three figures, which of course are all male, and which exclude any other groups, minority groups that may have contributed to Puerto Rican culture, including the United States, which is sort of absent in this mid-20th century representation of Puerto Ricanness, is quite exclusive. It's quite elitist in many ways. And finally, that the discourse, as well as the image that you see here on the screen, privileges the Spanish root, and to a lesser extent, the Indian root. And that is exactly how the various programs that the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture put in place, beginning with the restoration of the Spanish colonial heritage in Old San Juan, with contests that highlight the Taíno contribution to Puerto Rican culture, and less so for the African contribution to Puerto Rican identity. My final slide then is to, again, just mention that with the growing migration of Dominicans, and to a lesser extent Cubans, to Puerto Rico since the 1960s, there has been a tendency to consider all Dominicans as Black. This particular Dominican actually would probably be called a Hawao, again, a person who has relatively light skin and curly hair, even blue or green eyes. But all Dominicans in Puerto Rico have been stigmatized as Black, and therefore, again, they experience the same kinds of rejection and marginalization that Puerto Rican Blacks have experienced, which, by the way, invites comparisons with the situation of Haitian immigrants in the Dominican Republic. So to conclude, then, I would argue that what makes the Caribbean a distinctive region is, of course, first of all, the geographic location of the islands and the surrounding territories, the historical impact of European colonization, and particularly the development of the plantation economy that dominated most of the islands. And then as a result of that, the cultural characteristics, such as the African heritage that is more or less prevalent in each one of these countries. I've also argued that you can make a case for the three Hispanic Caribbean islands as being distinct from the rest of the region. Of course, for other purposes, you can also argue that they have much in common. But because of the demography, because of the length of Spanish colonization, the presence of Spanish as a unified language, and the lack of a Creole, there is much to be said about the ways in which these Hispanic Caribbean societies emerge over time and continue to be distinctive from the rest of the area. And finally, well, next to final, I would highlight again in the context of this webinar, there is a significant African heritage in all territories, which has been documented in music and the borrowing of African loans of words that are still used today, religion, which can be very hybrid and very syncretic, the food, and of course, the very visible presence of people of African origin, despite being minorities in the three countries that I have spoken about. My final point then is that just to remind you that regardless of these characteristics that are shared to some extent throughout the region and throughout the entire area of the Caribbean, each one of these countries has developed their own particular ideology and their own particular discourse about race, and that the folk racial terms that I summarized in the presentation reflect that kind of thinking and practice about how to deal with the racial and ethnic diversity of the population. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing the screen. And then maybe ask Alberto, do you want to moderate the discussion, or should I go ahead and?
Sure. I think I can also start with a question that I have, probably. I'm not sure if there are more questions in the chat.
Denise has some questions.
Wonderful.
And you
Alberto,
can feel free to unmute.
I'm sorry?
Alberto, did you want to go first, or?
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Duani, there are some authors such as Antonio Benitez Rojo, who has pointed out that cities such as New York and Miami are part of the Caribbean also. Can you please elaborate a little bit about this idea of continuity of the Caribbean here in the United States?
Yeah, I think there's a point to be made about the need to extend the borders of the Caribbean, right? So because again, I mentioned, for example, in the case of Puerto Rico, which is probably the Caribbean country that has a larger number and share of its population living in the United States, it doesn't make any sense to make a tight distinction between the island and the mainland. And similarly, I think for many other countries, it would make sense, I think, to expand the traditional geographic insular definition to places like New York, like Miami, like Toronto, like cities in Paris and London, where you have such a vibrant presence of Caribbean people and their descendants. However, for the purposes of teaching and doing research about the Caribbean, I think it does have still some merit to focus specifically on the islands with, again, the consideration of seeing what the transnational connections are between the islands and their diasporas. No? And therefore, any discussion of the Caribbean, whether it's the Hispanic Caribbean or the entire region, should take into account that, in fact, it is the region of the world which is probably the one with the highest number of migrants of all regions.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. I think that we can pass to Denise and later Leonardo.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Duani. It made me think of the blancamiento of even historical Black figures, such as Antonio Maceo in Cuba. When you look at artistic depictions of a figure like him, you see that whitening happen. And even that the term mulatto can be considered pejorative if we take a look at its etymology. My question, though, is in terms of the data depicting racial self-identification, you provided some from the CIA Factbook, for example. Could you say more as to what extent categories for identifying as Black or as Afrodescendiente are available as options for self-identification? And I'm thinking of other Latin American countries, such as Bolivia, which only until 2010 had a category distinctly available to identify as Afrodescendiente, or Nicaragua also in 2010. What's been the case for El Caribe?
Yeah, that's a great question. To begin with the end, I think all three countries have had some sort of, well, actually the term that has been used since the 19th century in censuses is Black. So, and Black and white. So those two extremes have not changed substantially, except that, of course, as I mentioned, the Dominican Republic eliminated the racial question altogether in 1960, as well as Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico did not ask a race question in any form from 1950 to 2000. Now it is the same question that is asked here in the United States, which, by the way, poses some problems, right? Because, for example, if you remember what the question is in the census in the US, it's Black or African American. Well, African American, even if it's translated to Afroamericano, oftentimes is considered to be referring to Black Americans rather than to Black Puerto Ricans or other Latinos. So, yeah, so I would say that part of the question is relatively straightforward to answer. However, there's an entire theoretical and political discussion as to what these numbers mean, right? So I think where you're coming from, you're aware of the fact that, of course, these racial statistics are not objective. They're not scientific. They are ways in which governments impose, in many ways, their own racial categories on the population and then classify them for political purposes. And one of the interesting things that I have seen when looking at the censuses, for example, Puerto Rico and Cuba, which I know better, is how these terms changed, right? So I mentioned the term pardo and moreno, which were used in the 19th century in the censuses under Spain. Those terms are no longer used in censuses. Again, in Black or white. And then I have also been struck by the use of the term mestizo, which is still used in the Dominican Republic and in Cuba officially. And there are no mestizos, technically speaking, in either countries, right? Because of the very few people of indigenous origin. And you're right, I think mulatto can be used in a very pejorative term. So maybe that's one of the reasons why mestizo is preferred officially to mulatto. I don't know that I answered the entire question, but that's a very thought-provoking question.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Leo.
Thank you, Dr. Duani, for that great presentation. I think it should be played every day during the conference because it is the background of what we will be talking about. And I want to follow up with what Denise was talking about and then ask you a question about what we have inherited, this racism, this cultural racism that we have inherited that actually today when you ask somebody from Cuba or from another Caribbean island of Hispanic heritage, when you ask, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Cuba, but my grandparents are from Spain. So this cultural blanqueamiento, why do you think there is that need, including myself, and this applies to what I will be talking about tomorrow, understanding yourself in order to understand your students, is like, why is that we have that need to skip the island, to identify ourselves with, our grandparents' heritage, which is, Spanish, in my case, Gypsies, but Spaniards.
Yeah, great question, Leo. Well, first of all, I think the most immediate response that I can think of is because of the centuries of slavery and colonialism and racism, right? The entire colonial period, as you know well because you study it, was based on this very racist distinction between blacks and whites, and then others, right? Particularly those who were considered free people of color. And that distinction, I think, is part of the colonial heritage, even to this day. Even after Cuba and Dominican Republic became independent, Puerto Rico did not. We're still grappling with the ideological consequences of this idea of racial and white supremacy. I don't think there's any way to avoid that conclusion. However, I think there are specific aspects of the problem that also can help to understand it. First of all, as you know, and I mentioned it briefly, Cuba became Hispanicized in a massive way at the end of the colonial period and even in the Republican period, right? So I think the numbers, if I remember correctly, talk about 700,000 Spaniards who came between 1902 and 1930, including my own grandmother, who was from the Canary Islands. So I sympathize with that issue now that I'm looking at family trees and so on, but I don't want to single my case necessarily, but I think it is quite common for many contemporary Cubans, both living in the US as well as in Cuba, to say, oh, my grandparents were from Galicia and my great-grandfather was from the Canary Islands, because it's such a recent and massive immigration. But still, the question is, why do Cubans, and I guess you could extend it to the other two islands as well, why do they feel such a need to highlight those ethnic origins rather than the others, right? The mixtures of people of African origin, particularly. Well, I think it goes back to this very strong feeling, well, the ideology of blanqueamiento too, which I think is part of the story, right? The idea that even if you know that you're in Puerto Rico, they say, "Y tu abuela dónde está?" No? Where is your grandmother? And people are aware that they have some African origin, but if they are able to forget that, so to speak, or at least to make it less visible by marrying with lighter skinned people and pretending to be white, then that will help, if not them, their children and grandchildren. So those are my 2 cents on that question.
Anyway, am I on, please?
Go ahead.
Yes, you are.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to say that this is something that I have also dealt with my classes at Nassau Community College English department, but my specialty is global African studies. And fundamentally, it boils down to the idea of human dignity. Being brought across as an African consigned you to a status of inferiority. And everybody craves respect. And I see this even among African Americans. Somebody may be as dark as I am or darker, and as soon as they mention their identity as African American, but my parents were from Ireland or Britain or that kind of thing. So it is that unease, identity unease, that continues to plague us. And it does not help matters when we have had Trump and other people constantly reminding the rest of us that if you are not from maybe Nazi Germany or some other place, you don't count. When American culture civilization points to the fact that America is a melange of minority cultures creating this culture. I mean, from music to the food to everything that you mentioned here. America is not white. I mean, but there is this desperation to Europeanize America beyond just geography, but in terms of color, and so that is where the problem is coming from. It is not that there is something wrong with these people. It is that they want to remind you that I also deserve to be respected, to be recognized. Unfortunately, they may be using the wrong labels to try to bring them to themselves, that kind of dignity that, we do that even in African society. I mean, I am directly descended from King Osei Tutu. In fact, I discovered it from our school library. I had known King Osei Tutu is the founder of the Ashanti Empire and that kind of thing. And I lived most of my life until the last 10 years. I had a sense. I mean, some others knew about it, but I didn't know. So I grew up mostly not being aware of this. Recently, I discovered that the king of the Ashantis is my cousin, and a whole lot of other things coming up. And these things help you to bring, I get this kind of psychological high from it. They didn't raise me, they didn't give me anything. I don't get money or anything from it. But it is that kind of, is that ontological, psychical, human beings are more than what we see. We crave that kind of, at the end of the day, I often assign my English students to write about how they got their names. And at the end of the assignment, I'll tell them that we all have one name. And it is because you don't see anybody saying that my name means stupid, dummy, or that kind of thing. Most of the names deal with achievements, heroic achievements by somebody's ancestor and that kind of thing. So fundamentally, it comes down to one word, dignity. And so that is where the issue is coming from. How do we create a society where everybody is dignified, that we don't have to be, embarrassed about our backgrounds, to be struggling to be respected and recognized. So when I listen to these discourses and all these conversations, and I like coming in there, and I love the part, especially in Latin America, because it is one of the most complicated areas to talk about ethnicity, race, culture, and especially if you're talking about, human dignity, equality, and things of that nature. And I live in a predominantly, I believe, Dominican, Puerto Rican community also, and I see the Dutch, where the so-called elephant in the room, it is there, but it is not there. So because people feel uneasy about it. They know it is there, but nobody feels comfortable about dealing with it. I watched elections go on in Santo Domingo when I lived in Washington Heights by the bridge. You would think the capital of Santo Domingo was Washington Heights. And then, and then almost everybody is looking somewhere about my dark sepia color to very white. But then you are looking at the presidents all being white. And I remember there was a black guy who ran years ago, and they couldn't say that. I think his ancestors came over from Haiti or someplace. That was a Balaguer time. And when it became obvious that he had been discriminated against, they brought out this idea that the guy was a socialist and socialism was in the 50s and that kind of thing. But you knew the question was about race. It was obvious. And, it's very interesting. But
Thank you for your comment. I think we're running out of time, so I want to ask whether we have time for another question, Alberto? Or no?
Yeah, we have time for another question. We have Luciana's question, and she's going to be the last one.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for letting me speak. My question comes from an anecdote that I lived when I was in Barcelona. I was working for an editing company with an Argentinian editor-in-chief. So I was writing contents, and I was thinking that I was doing my best and my writing was excellent for Argentina, because my contents were sent to Argentina for publication. So the Argentinian editor told me, "Oh, your texts are excellent, but they are too Caribbean." And I say, "Why is that possible? I am South American." I say, no, you are Caribbean. I say, "Okay, thank you so much. It's the first time I realized outside of my country, that is Venezuela, that I am absolutely Caribbean. And I felt proud of it, but it was a surprise. I say, your writing is exquisite, but it's sometimes the proximity is the voluptuosity, I don't know. And I felt I discovered very strange things and new things about my writing. So I wanted to ask if it is something common that happens, that we have a peculiar way of writing or conceiving things that makes us Caribbean expression, a Caribbean writing, because it stayed on my mind forever. It marked my life. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luciana. Well, I'll let the literary scholars in the webinar to talk about that particular aspect of the Caribbean writing. And I think, of course, it would require a comparison of literary texts in Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. I know there are people who do that. That's not my expertise, but I would say that, of course, regarding the Spanish that's spoken in the Caribbean, and in these particular countries, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, there's something to be said about the connections within this area. So, and even perhaps in Venezuela, and I think that there's an argument to be made that there's a dialect, a Spanish Caribbean dialects that distinguish from Argentinian Spanish and Peninsular Spanish or Mexican Spanish. Again, I'm not an expert on the topic, but I do think that is one of the distinctive characteristics of the region in terms of vocabulary, pronunciation, not so much the grammar. No, it's interesting that you note that there was something about the writing. If I read a text written in Argentina and compare it to a text written in Cuba, I don't think I will find many grammatical differences. However, if the Argentinian reads the text and the Cuban reads the text, then of course you immediately recognize the so-called accent. But other than that, I think there's no, at least no obvious difference in the ways that people write in different dialects of Spanish, unless they're trying to reproduce the oral, quality of the dialect, where yes, you would find marked differences in the language. One final response to that is that I just thought about a study that was published before the pandemic by Professor Carter from FIU, comparing the way different dialects are perceived here in Miami. You might be familiar with that, because he asked a Spanish from Spain, a fellow from Colombia, and a Cuban. All of them were educated, and all of them from the capitals of their countries. And then, asked FIU students what they thought about it. Well, I think we all know more or less what to expect. The Spanish from Spain was considered to be more cultured, more educated, more academic, whereas the Cuban dialect was considered to be the worst, the less standard. And Colombian Spanish was supposed to be in the middle. Again, I think that has a lot to do with the way the Caribbean was peopled, especially by poor, in many cases African, but also Spanish peasants, who spoke a Spanish that's not the standard that we're supposed to be teaching, right, in universities. And I remember myself when I was teaching as a teaching assistant many years ago, we were told by our supervisors to pronounce all the words, slowly. Don't eat the S's at the end of the word, and don't use words like guagua, because supposedly that was not correct Spanish. But I think we're cheating. Our students are learning in many cases this textbook kind of Spanish that maybe in Colombia or in Madrid is common, but not necessarily in Caracas or in Havana.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Juan.